I suppose Tyler mentioned. My name is Christine Pavey, and I'm going to talk tonight about the clitoris. So when I first shared with some of my peers that I was going to be speaking about this tonight, their first and really only reaction was laughter. And why wouldn't it be? I mean, the idea that anybody would talk honestly or deeply about something like the clitoris is absolutely unheard of. The body part itself is so controversial that it is not actually written in anatomy texts for sex ed classes. We have performed an ideological clitoridectomy in the United States. It is so dangerous that we have literally written this body part out of the textbooks. Now, I'd like to emphasize that tonight I'm using anatomically correct terms, and I'm not trying to use shock value, but rather talking about something that some people feel is shocking. So with an open mind, let's begin. So I think all of us could pretty much agree that the primary male erogenous zone is the penis. And I think you would probably also say, if I asked what the primary female erogenous zone was, you would say vagina, with the clitoris having a role somewhere between does not appear in this film and supporting actress of the year. I think it's interesting that when I teach sex ed, which I do on Mondays and Fridays, that the girls that we teach always refer to penis to vagina intercourse as real sex, rendering any other kind of sexual activities fluff. It's extra, it's foreplay, not to be taken seriously. Now I think there are two reasons for this. One being that penis to vagina intercourse is reproductive. That's how we've structured sex, is to say that it's for making babies, not for anything else. At least that's its serious work. Then I think also it's significant because we have structured sex around male needs. The penis is pretty much self-explanatory. It wants to be inserted into something, and we assume that female sexual needs will follow in the same vein. This renders the clitoris pretty much unimportant. It's supererogatory, something that you do that's extra. The idea of penetration defining sex fabricates a vaginocentric understanding of women's sexual bodies. And we are so committed to this idea because we need to believe, in order for the dominant paradigm to hold up, that women and men are perfectly complementary. We want to believe that women's needs are met by meeting male needs. We have entirely restructured women's sexual bodies such that they are met by the same kinds of activities that meet male needs. It reminds me of the 1970s movie Deep Throat. Some of you might be old enough to have witnessed this phenomena, but for those of us who are a little younger, I'll give a brief synopsis. There's a young woman who is so unfortunate as to have been born without a clitoris. Distraught, she goes to a physician who, thank God, finds her clitoris in her throat. Now, I won't get into the details of why this is convenient for the filmmakers, but I argue that we have done the same thing in an equally ridiculous situation with the female vagina. We have structured women's sexuality in such a way that is absolutely convenient for men. But if we look at the physiological realities, we can see how absurd this is. The existence of the G-spot, the supposed vaginal erotic zone, is highly contested. In fact, there is no physiological evidence for its existence. There is no feeling in the vaginal walls past 2 inches, which is precisely where the G-spot is supposedly located. In fact, some doctors, scientists argue that the idea of the vagina as orgasmic doesn't make sense, given that its 2 primary roles are conception and childbirth. It doesn't really make sense that you would want to give birth through the most sensitive area of your body. Additionally, when we look at heterosexual communities, it's all about penetration. But when we look to lesbian communities, communities based more honestly and entirely on women's sexual experience, we don't have the same kind of emphasis on penetration. Which makes sense, given that the clitoris has over 8,000 nerve endings. That's twice as many that are in the male penis, all packed into 3 to 5 millimeters above the skin. Only 20% of women have ever reported having an orgasm from vaginal stimulation alone. And of that 20%, it takes an average of 20 minutes for women to reach climax. This is compared to a 4-minute interval of time given clitoral stimulation. And I have an interesting quote The vagina itself is thought to have no mechanism to stimulate pleasure or orgasm for women. So you might be wondering, like I do, if the clitoris is really where it's at, why do we talk about the vagina? I mean, what about the clitoris is so dangerous that we don't mention it in anatomy texts, that we're not supposed to talk about it, that we don't teach it in sex ed? Well, there are probably a lot of reasons, but I only have like 10 minutes, so I'm going to name 3. One being, it's inconvenient. Men have to get their hands dirty. And women have to do things that look a whole lot like masturbation to figure out how stuff works down there. Women and men's complementary model is really, really convenient because we meet male needs, and as a result, we meet female needs, and we never have to talk about women's sexual needs. They just happen. But the clitoris disagrees. Women's sexual realities are something you have to do. You have to seek it. It doesn't come as a derivative of meeting male needs. Now, 2, it subverts patriarchy. We're really, really dedicated to the idea of men as the yang and women as the yin. We want to think that they fit together perfectly, not only sexually, but in lifestyle and marriage and partnerships. There is wife and there is husband, and they serve 2 different roles that fit perfectly. And the clitoris says this isn't true. There are male needs and there are female needs, and they might overlap, they might be totally different, but we need to ask the questions about what women's needs really are. We can't assume that they won't be met by meeting male needs. Finally, we have to understand sex as something that isn't just for reproduction. You're not going to get a baby out of the clitoris, no matter how hard you try. We're really uncomfortable with acknowledging this in a Judeo-Christian society that really wants us to believe that sex is something that happens after marriage, to have a kid. And when we look at sex for non-reproductive purposes, as in it's an end in and of itself, valuable because it's valuable, suddenly heterosexual sex and homosexual sex doesn't look that different. It's not unnatural because they can't reproduce, because sometimes when a man and a woman do sex, they're not reproducing. The French have a nickname for the clitoris, and it's called the scorner of man. Now, I personally think that men and clitorises should be friends. But I do think we could call it the scorner of oppression. We have a lot that we can learn from the clitoris about sex, love, and liberation. And I think we should look to the clitoris for the kinds of questions we should be asking about how we have wrongfully structured women, whether it's physically, mentally, or emotionally.